Okay. Hello, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. Today is February 27th. We're on the record from 1 to 2. It's 1:01 p.m. right now. We're here to discuss AO 2026-27, which is an ordinance to Anchorage Assembly amending Anchorage Municipal Code, Chapter 2105, 2140 Old Code, and 2150 Old Code, and sections 2109 050, 2110 050, 2135 020 Old Code to clarify the land use review process for data centers and similar energy intensive facilities, and requesting the planning department develop use specific criteria for energy intensive uses and waiving planning and zoning commission. We'll start with introductions. Ms. Baldwin Day.
Aaron Baldwin Day.
Zach Johnson.
Daniel Bolland.
Anna Brawley.
Christopher Constant on the phone. Mr. Martinez.
Present, thank you.
All right, thank you. So this work session was requested by the sponsor, the vice chair, Ms. Brawley. Go ahead, Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. We got a few slides and we'll talk a little bit about the ordinance itself. So this is co-sponsored by myself and Member Boland. In the first part of the presentation, we're going to back up from what this ordinance does and really just talk about data centers, because we know this is a hot topic. Many other communities are actually further along than we are because they've seen a lot of construction. We're more in the future potential category, but it's helpful to understand what these facilities are, and that sets the stage for why we might want to regulate them. So next slide, please. So again, what are data centers? Why is everyone talking about them? Next slide again. Okay, so a data center is really, and I saw this phrase multiple times, powering the internet. So it's really a facility with a bunch of computers in it that is either running potentially an artificial intelligence model. These have actually been around for a long time. Cloud storage, right? A lot of different uses you can think of related to physical storage of data or physical data processing that we utilize on our phones, on our computers. All kinds of companies use these. A company might have one themselves. There might be one that has multiple functions at the same site. So they look like a lot of different things, but essentially, from a land use perspective, they are a building or multiple structures that have a lot of computer servers in them. That requires a cooling system of some kind, often water-based, but other models, because those servers, especially when they're together and there's a lot of them, generate a lot of heat. They also use a lot of energy, of course, and so often there can be energy generation on site. Maybe it's a backup generator, maybe it's a renewable energy system, and then they might have backup battery storage as well. So there's those pieces. And then, of course, because it's a very large building, you might have offices, parking, storage, right? The kinds of things you would think of it as an industrial facility. Next slide, please. So I think it's also important to understand that data centers can be large and small. So these are two examples that I found. One of them is in Iowa, but you can find, hundreds of pictures of these at this point. You can picture a very large warehouse, some infrastructure. You can just get a sense of the size of it. And there's something called a hyperscale facility. So these are the ones, that's generally the term for the really big ones, often for generative AI, are the ones that have really intensive computing needs. And so those are getting built all over the country. But also there are some closer to home. So this is one example, a company called GreenSpark. They have a project in Cordova. You can see it's literally that little green closet, essentially, is a data center. And so just to say, one typology of these is a very large building, but they can be small. They can be co-located with other things. That one in particular is co-located at their hydro facility because it's using hydropower. And my understanding is the hydro utility is actually storing its data on that data center itself. So so it also illustrates really these can look a lot of different ways and they can be used a lot of different ways. And they have a lot of potential benefits as well. So you can read about that one. There's another one being proposed in Wrangell. And the edge computing there is, I was starting to read about these things. I am not a data center investor. So a lot of these things are like how to make money off of these, but edge computing is really when you have smaller facilities, because the further away you have data, it has to physically travel. And so there's lag time. And so that's partly why there's so many outside of DC. There's so many in certain areas that they're serving those large needs. But in this case, this could be serving our local users closer to home so that there's less of that lag time. Next slide, please. So key characteristics, again, I mentioned, and these are, again, things to think about in terms of impacts and what we think of for land use regulation. Am I too close, too far? Okay. Is they have intensive energy use, primarily electricity, intensive water use for the water-based cooling systems. They can also produce wastewater with certain contaminants in them. Like I said, they may have on-site power generation, especially because they are so energy intensive and they're often built, they can be built kind of way out of town. And then another key thing is they typically have very little human activity on site. So they might have folks, obviously janitorial, maintenance, repairs, but they are not a place where you see a bunch of people, a bunch of humans doing jobs, right? That's a key factor. Obviously, lots of jobs for construction, but not for operation. And then I pulled out this quote from Pew Research Center. There's a lot of really good kind of overviews of what these are and how much this sector is growing. So just to say, again, this is a large center, not something like what we're seeing in Cordova. But one of these buildings basically can use as much electricity as 100,000 households or more. And it's worth noting that Anchorage is about 100,000 households. So when we're talking about scale, again, I don't want to be, I guess doom selling or whatever, but it is really just the scale of these things and the scale of energy requirements is massive, and so it's really worth understanding that even though it looks like a warehouse, it's very different. Next slide. So again, data center is very rapidly growing sector. The number of them, the size of them, and the investment made in them, especially with the growth of AI. It was hard to actually find what the number of them is. So I found 4,000, then I found 5,388 just in the last year. And then again, looking at electricity use in particular, about 1/4 of Virginia's total electrical supply usage in 2023 was these centers. And so again, they're huge. And just the scale and the speed of the growth of this sector is worth noting, because again, as we face our own energy challenges up here, I think it raises questions, like where is this going to come from, right? So next slide, please. And I tried to put footnotes here as much as possible. So I think really what the mindset we should have here is really balancing, right? So there's a lot of opportunity with these, a lot of benefits that communities have seen, and also a lot of kind of known costs and impacts. And we have some examples of those. So on the pro side, we're seeing economic activity, but they also can be generators of tax revenue. So both real property tax, right? It's a big building or a smaller building, but it has a value. Personal property tax that we've talked about a lot, all those servers, all that equipment, they're not like vehicles. You can't drive them out of town and park them in Wasilla on January 1st. And they're very valuable. And so communities have seen a boost in that as well. And one I forgot to put on here also is, when you have a new ratepayer enter your utility, that is additional revenue. So there is, in theory, a way that something like this that's paying a lot of money to access that utility, paying a high rate, that could offset residential rates, but it can also go the other way. So cons. Obviously, it's a large footprint. It uses a lot of physical space in a community, especially these larger ones, and doesn't create a lot of operating jobs. So that's kind of a trade-off there, versus like a big box store, right, where a retail store has a number of employees inside of it who are doing the work. It can have noise impacts. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then, of course, water usage and energy usage. So these are things just to consider, again, where we are a resource development state, for example. We should not, and we do not approach resource development with, well, let's just give it all away, right? We have to have the conversation about what's in the public interest. How do we balance the needs of these facilities with other needs and other demands on our systems? Next slide, please.
Real quick, I would offer there might be one more con to put on there, and that's pollution. And so the noise impacts are one form of pollution, but there are kind of arguments about nitrogen dioxide and other particulates that come in the exhaust of these buildings. So
yeah, for sure. And we'll get into that a little bit with the water side. Next slide, please. Okay, so local updates from other communities. So this is actually a conversation that's been going on in many other places for the last few years, probably before that as well. I'm part of the National League of Cities Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources Committee. And so I've been hearing since I joined that committee from other places in Arizona, California, Ohio, talking about kind of concerns about these or really what the impacts have been once they're built. And so there's really a lot of work that's been done to try to play catch up, essentially. So And we know, for example, states like Ohio, I'm going to keep using Ohio because it's my home state, but also they're one of the epicenters of this. They have offered really aggressive tax incentives at the state level. And so they've seen a lot of them built. And of course, those state decisions have made complications at the local level. Another thing, as mentioned, the noise, we shouldn't minimize that. Certainly, I live near the airport, so I'm familiar with occasional noise. These are really continual noise, and there's actually been a couple communities that have really tried to pursue noise violations and other issues like that. So, and then of course, if you're talking about somewhere like California, Arizona, water usage and water scarcity is a massive issue. So that is less of our issue here, but certainly wastewater and treatment of that is still an issue. Next slide, please. So again, as I said, if one of these is built, it can be a very large new ratepayer in your system and can be beneficial. But I pulled just this example from Columbus in the last year, saying that they are seeing their own utility costs likely going up. And some of that is there's certainly a lot more housing being built in those areas. And so they are really working to expand their water treatment plant and these other pieces. But as it says there, and as they have said on the record many times, data centers are a large driver of that. So not just Columbus proper, but the metro area and even out, in Dayton, other communities that are a couple hours outside of that city itself. So we know this is an issue. And I give these specific examples just to say it's not a hypothetical, it's what other places are experiencing in real time. Next slide, please. So then we said, well, what are some examples of local regulation that we should look at? So I searched around, found a few different ones, but I want to highlight first National League of Cities, NLC. They've been doing work on this, not just the land use side of it, but thinking about, what utilities need to think about, the energy considerations. But then I also looked at the Urban Land Institute. So the Urban Land Institute, ULI, is really basically like a real estate trade association, I guess, or they do a lot of work, but they're not coming from the place of regulation for regulation's sake. They're coming from how do we make this work for the folks trying to build them in the private sector and the public sector. And so they had a really good balanced approach. So I encourage looking at that. There's links in the memo itself. And then I'll note also Virginia, as I said, is one of the epicenters of this, along with Ohio. They have been doing a lot of work at the county level to look at how to change their zoning code essentially to account for these. So a couple examples, Loudoun County, Virginia, they were allowing them as by right uses, meaning that they would go through building permit review, but not a specific kind of land use review beyond the very basics. And so they have retroactively put into place a special land use permit, or I think they called it a special exception permit. So not treating them as something that has to get built or that would get built in all circumstances. Others are looking at districts. They're looking at overlay zones, especially if there's multiple in one place. So there's a lot of places really that we can look to at this point that are leading the way in that. Next slide, please. So now switching over to where do these fit into Title 21 or what is the problem we're trying to solve here? So next slide. So first, again, I'll state the goals, really balancing the economic potential and the benefits of this technology and this kind of investment in our community. It could be a way to get more renewable energy projects that feed back into the grid, right? There's a lot of kind of possible here, but there's also known impacts. And so that's really where I think land use and zoning, when it's at its best, is dealing with those health and safety impacts. Second is to create a clear and predictable process for these. Again, they're not really contemplated in code. We'll talk about that in a second, but making sure that it is clear if somebody says, I want to build a data center, what happens after they show up at the counter. We want to be proactive. So to our knowledge, there's no active project application out there right now, but we know it's a matter of time before we see one, whether it's a small one or potentially a large one, potentially one co-located at the port or the airport, right? There's different scenarios here. And then lastly, we know this is kind of a first step, but more research is probably needed. So again, kind of keeping in step with what other communities are doing and adjusting our rules accordingly. So next slide. So first, let's remind ourselves, zoning, part of the purpose of zoning is to really regulate nuisances and impactful facilities. So I put this brick, there literally is a place called the Acme Brick Factory in somewhere in Texas. And that's what it looked like, I guess, 100 years ago. But the point there is there's case law that I learned in my planning school days, Hadachek versus Sebastian, which said that the local government or the government has the ability or the authority to regulate things for life safety, or I think it was health, safety, public welfare. We used to say morals as well. We don't say that so much anymore, but that it is within the local government's power to do that. And that's really one of the foundational cases that established, what we know as zoning now. And so just to point out though, at the time, that case was, I don't remember all the details, but it was about a brick factory, and you can imagine dust and noise. And if that's next to a neighborhood, it can be problematic. So that's what it looked like 100 or so years ago. Fast forward to now, we still make things, we still have messy facilities, but really the impacts are with energy, they're with noise, they're with other things at these facilities that can still be impactful, but it looks different. So I'm not saying that this is the same as a brick factory, but we should think about kind of, again, what is some of the purpose of zoning and what can we use these tools for? Next slide. So there's a clear gap in Title 21. So the closest things that you can find, just trying to describe what does a big building with a bunch of servers look like. The two closest besides a utility itself, which local governments don't regulate, we have data processing facility, which that's the definition now. Very 1990s, where it's talking about processing credit card transactions with employees. And so that sounds to me more like an office building, right? So it's fundamentally not the way that these things are set up. And then similarly, a warehouse is a very large building, but it's got physical goods and materials and often has, you're moving those things around and maybe you're actually selling at wholesale, so that if you read that code, it looks like basically is something a Costco or not is kind of built into that code too, how much retail sales you're doing. So those two things don't really fit. So next slide. So what does this propose? It proposes defining data center as a distinct use type. And then it's got some more detail there. There's large facilities, small facilities, contemplating that those can have different impacts, and doesn't touch those other existing uses, which there may be properties that are already designated with that use. It allows for looking at an application as one project. So that was something ULI identified, that if there's 3 different phases or there's 3 different parcels that this is being built on, rather than having 3 separate applications moving, that you can look at it holistically, or if they're building in phases, things like that. So that's one thing it says. It amends the use table to say that data centers are only allowed in certain zones. So it does not allow them in residential zones. It would allow them in industrial zones. And it also includes port, airport, PLI. The use tables are in the back. And with all of those, it makes them a conditional use. So again, not a by right use, but requires going through the process that we already have to evaluate facilities that have known impacts and really need to be, I think, thoroughly vetted by the community before approval. And then lastly, it requests that planning staff do some research, come back in the future if there are changes we should make, or maybe there's a great idea that another community has that we could adapt here. So that's really what it does. And it also, I'm gonna say it amends old Title 21, which is really a vestige of the fact that there's some properties that are still zoned under old zoning code. And I know there's a plan to move everything into new Title 21, but some of those areas are things like the Ted Stevens Airport or places where these things could get built, essentially. And so making sure that that's not a loophole or a gap there. So, but really putting the same set of standards in there. Next slide, just a couple more slides, I think. So some of the conditions, because if we do conditional use, we should think about what is the criteria that Planning and Zoning Commission would use. So there's some basic design standards. I'll say ULI actually had a lot more of them, and I know we've had our own conversation about design standards in Anchorage. So really looking at what is the minimum ones that we should do. There was recommendation of visual screening for buildings, especially enclosure of power generation, having a front entrance that's visually distinct, which sounds like a minor aesthetic thing. But if you're looking at a giant box, it's like, okay, how would I get into that box? That seems like a pretty minimum standard. And then some landscaping requirements. And again, especially for large centers. So thinking about if it's a very large building, it's going to have different visual impacts than the Green Spark one in a closet. It has recommended 200-foot setbacks from residential, again, with the goal that we're trying to mitigate noise. And so not saying 200-foot setbacks in all cases, but if it's right next to a neighborhood, that's really the concern there. Some noise mitigation study required to again, look up front, how much noise do we expect this to make? Again, and that'll scale up as it gets to be a bigger facility. sufficient fire suppression. And then really, again, we don't regulate the utilities, but asking the utilities, whatever process they need to go through, I think Planning and Zoning Commission would naturally ask, can the grid support this facility? And so really asking the utilities to say on whatever end their process is, can you meet the capacity of this? And so I've reached out to Chugach and talked with AWU, so they can speak to, I know Allison is here from AWU, speak to what their considerations with this would be, but really just saying, have you talked to the utilities? Have you guys worked it out?
Question for you there.
Yeah.
So did you look at the marijuana code?
Not specifically.
So in the marijuana code, we have a requirement that they do exactly that. They take their power generation needs and go to the utility and get the utility to demonstrate that the utility can support the supply need of that institution. So there is a strong precedent within our code for this action.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to make a note and we'll come back to that. Yeah, and again, the goal is really just to make sure that conversation happens, and then whatever permitting, whatever other process that those folks need to use is separate from our land use code. Next slide, please. I think this is the last one. So lastly, I got this question from somebody, and of course, this is the hot topic always when we do this, why waive planning and zoning review? So there's really 4 reasons. One is this is a brand new use, and so I think if we sent it to P&Z, I think they would have some substantive conversation about what it would look like, but I don't know that they have the expertise to say this is what this brand new use should look like. And so that's one thing. So really looking at other communities first, who have already done that research, especially those who have been dealing with these for a few years. Second, it doesn't alter our existing process or any existing uses. So it's really putting something into code that wasn't there before. 3 is it's timely. We have an opportunity to be proactive before an application comes in, because I think communities that have tried to do this on the back end now are facing legal issues, or there's kind of 2 sets of rules depending on when you built it. That's not a good situation to be in. And then lastly is really practical. Planning and Zoning Commission has a lot on its plate already. And so realistically, if we sent this to them, it would come back probably 4 or 5 months from now. And again, I don't know if they would have, I respect them a lot, but I don't know that they would have substantive recommendations that would change the text of this until staff have a chance to do more research. And so that's really the rationale is I think this is, it's not urgent, but it's very timely. And also I think there's an opportunity to come back and do more work. And it's built into the ordinance. So I think that's the last slide. And then Dan, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Nothing for me.
Okay.
I would add back on the marijuana thing that we require the applicant to actually upgrade the system on their own dime to achieve the output that they're demanding. And so it's not even a subsidy system or a can we, it's like, if you want it and it doesn't exist, you must then provide it. And anyhow, it's important to keep in mind. Mr. Johnson, I think you were going to ask a question.
Yeah, thanks. So looking at the definitions here, I sort of said a data center is a data center if it uses 20 megawatts of electricity. Can you guys just elaborate a little bit on how you pick that number, or something to give us a sense of scale for what that looks like?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I should have said before, actually to Mr. Constance's point and your point, there's 2, I'll get back to the question. There's 2 state bills right now. One of them is HB 259 with Representative Mears. And it has it really digs more into the utility piece of it, because that's a state level function, and recommends requires actually that a facility enter a community benefit agreement. So essentially negotiate what that looks like. I think it's a great idea. I opted not to put it in here because that bill is going to move through its own process, and this is really land use. But all that to say, and then the other bill is Senate Bill 250, Senator Tobin's bill, and it does dig even more into kind of that utility question, like whether the center has to build its own capacity, things like that. So I think those are great things to track. The 20 megawatt threshold is actually from HB 259. And I got a question, and I'm wondering maybe if we either lower that threshold or remove it, because I think the number of servers is another way to define it. And if it's too high, we wouldn't want to exclude something that is smaller than that, but it's still going to have the same sort of impact. So that's the question. It came from that state bill, and you might take it out.
I mean, it's an interesting question, right? And I guess I don't have a strong sense of how would we define it, but I would just want to be mindful that we wouldn't want to potentially capture uses that were not intended here, right? I can imagine maybe a large office facility in town. Some might have a number of servers in the basement already, and that's sort of they're obviously not functioning primarily as a data center, but that's sort of an ancillary use for them. And so I just, whatever definition we go with, I think we'd want to just be mindful of the fact that I wouldn't want to pull in uses that, we're not actually trying to address or concerned about, or maybe already functioning in our community without creating problems. So I don't know. I mean, and maybe server is a better definition. I don't know. Is there a standard definition of what constitutes a server, or does that get fuzzy as well?
I think we can look into that. I'm not
Okay.
sure. Yeah.
I guess just in the interim, then, if we're sticking with 20 megawatts, is there, and I guess I can look at HB 259 to see. But do you have a sense of what a 20 megawatt facility looks like? I mean, is that, yeah, I mean, is that building that covers half an acre, or could you fit a 20 megawatt server farm in this room theoretically? I mean, I'm guessing it's maybe somewhere in between, but.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I found kind of different resources on it. I guess I'll point, so we did provide the NLC, they have some fact sheets on data centers, and they're really talking about these larger ones, but it says the average one has about 2,000 to 5,000 servers, and then it says that one of that size draws around 100 megawatts of power. And I think the other complication other communities have found is sometimes the real specifics about these facilities can end up being proprietary, because people can say, oh, I can calculate what you're doing and why based on the amount of water you're using or things like that. So, and we're not taking that as a given that that's proprietary information, but it's also makes it difficult to characterize, what is the minimum of these or what is typical. But I did see that basically, even a small one likely has about 500 servers in it.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions? So I don't see any more questions. I will just go ahead, Ms. Hollanday.
What are there significant air quality impacts to data centers and based on the size of the operation? What do we know about that?
It's a good question. I don't remember seeing that so much as noise and then potential contaminants in wastewater. But I can point out, so the NLC resource, there's actually 3 of them. There's what is data centers, energy and kind of environmental considerations, and then land use. So I'm just quickly scrolling because I think it's less air. I guess the way that it would be connected is if you have a place that's primarily still burning coal or some kind of, it's really about what energy source you're using. But I haven't seen something that says.
They say in this packet, which I think is really good, interesting reading. So I think that, perhaps the facility itself is not directly contributing to air pollution, but the packet says if the electricity source for the data centers is powered by fossil fuels, these facilities may contribute to climate change and air pollution, either locally or at remote generation sites. So I think there's like a follow along effect there.
Is there any precedent elsewhere? And full disclosure, I have not read the NLC packet. I look forward to doing so. Is there any precedent elsewhere for requiring that a data center operator either pay into or utilize renewables as part of their operation?
I think it's a good question, and I believe Senator Tobin's bill either encourages or requires. I don't remember. So it's a good question to look into. And I think the challenge with land use code is like, what are the boundaries of what we can do, right? And so that's why I'm excited. I do think that the state really needs to take action in some way, whether it's through the utility piece or things like that. But that's the challenge is we just have our little old zoning code, but we can look into that.
What is Senator Tobin's bill number? Would you repeat that?
Senate Bill 250.
250. Okay. Thank you.
Can I add on to that? So I think that is a very salient question because, really what we're trying to dig at is what is the potential economic benefit of these to our community versus the economic detriment? And, is there in the future, is this something that we look at like a stormwater utility? Or, if you're going to consume this much of our finite energy resources, do you have to put something back into the system? Or do you have to, is there a data center tax in the future, or a consumption tax that we could look at to invest in renewables, or just general infrastructure that these things might require? I mean, think about not only the facilities themselves, right? But will these require, because they take up so much room, so much land, what is the infrastructure that's going to have to support these? Are we going to be having to pave and maintain new roads to these facilities? So I think there's a lot of questions in future work, and that's why I appreciate that Anna has in here the follow-up work by the planning department, that this can be an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And, I think when we're faced with sort of the energy reality, the landscape that we have right now, where we're already talking about the rising cost of natural gas, we're talking about importing for our own needs in terms of energy, to have a major draw on that system just accelerates the time frame, with which we're paying more and more and more as a community for these resources. And so to me, it makes sense that if we had a major, a new ratepayer of this kind of scale, that we would want to require investment in renewables as a part of that, as a part of them being part of us. And again, not clear on the mechanism for that happening. And if that is, as Member Walton suggested, a tax or something along those lines. But to me, that seems like a really important piece of this equation. Yes, we have Title 21, but I think we need to think about what other tools there are to be sure that if, in fact, a data center or two lands in Anchorage, that they are contributing positively to a better energy future for all of us.
Dean.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to speak to Ms. Baldwin Day's question about required renewables. I'm not sure in the land use context that you were concerned about, but I think that is a possible use of a tax incentive program that we have in our code, chapter 1275. It's property assessed clean energy program, PACER. And, part of the definition for a qualified improvement is using renewable energy or clean energy and so forth. I'm paraphrasing. I'm not super, I guess, knowledgeable about this chapter. I haven't seen it in place, and the whole chapter is kind of not super detailed either. But that's just sort of one avenue for them to look at least for an owner that's thinking of building a data center or renovating an existing building, to get some tax incentives out of it. So, chapter 1275.
So I just want to speak to some nonsense I've heard out in the community, that this is the assembly attempting to shut down economic development in our town. No, I want to put it plainly on the record here that what this is, the assembly doing, is contemplating our land use code for impacts to residences and other users who might find themselves inadvertently right next door to a massive industrial facility that they didn't ask for and we didn't contemplate. And there's a national movement right now to look at this. And I think that our record over the last 5 years demonstrates that we're working hard to streamline our code to ensure that people can develop properties meaningfully, that are profitable, that provide housing and other uses that are important to our neighborhoods. But I just want to speak it plain to the record that this is not what the nonsense peddlers are out there peddling about, that this is an effort to do our due diligence to make sure that any economic development initiative that happens very near and dear to people's homes is done in a thoughtful way.
Yeah, thanks. And to that point, can you, Jasmine, can you go to slide 13? Because there's many pictures of these data centers. A lot of them are renderings because they're about, proposed ones. But I just want to point out that picture gave me pause on the right, that there's a cul-de-sac literally right next to that building. So again, setbacks from residential areas, that is why you would do that.
So I actually think a 200-foot setback is quite reasonable in the grand scheme of things. And we potentially could go even a little bit further, if you consider we actually have residential zones in Anchorage that require 50-foot setbacks for a house, right? And, you know, for all the sturm and drang on social media of us trying to, you know, limit these, this ordinance is not to prohibit these data centers. It is to be really thoughtful about how we allow them, where we allow them, because I think probably some of those same commenters would be pretty upset if they were in this situation demonstrated by the picture on the right, and the data center was built right next to their house. So yeah, just trying to be thoughtful about where these could potentially be placed in the future.
A little caveat, they would be really, really upset, especially if it was built, nobody told them, the land was sold, they had a by right use, and then it just showed up all of a sudden. And that's where people would be really livid. And so what this process does is it provides the public an opportunity to meaningfully understand what's coming near them in the future. And so that, to me, is a protection worth contemplating on Tuesday. Okay. That's everything. Anyone on the phone? I don't know that I noted Member Silvers had joined us, I think, at about 1:15. So that then we'll stand adjourned. We'll be back Tuesday for our regularly scheduled meeting. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.